The metallic clang of the cell door echoing through the sterile corridor was a sound Captain Sarah had grown to despise. It wasn't just the noise, it was the final punctuation mark to another failed attempt, another day lost in the suffocating silence of their captivity. Her back, despite the rough texture of the cold, alien cot, remained ramrod straight. Years of military discipline had etched an unyielding resilience into her posture, a silent defiance that even the most advanced alien psychological torment couldn't break. Sarah was one of the last. One of the few senior officers of the United Earth Federation to be captured alive during the disastrous First Contact War with the Xylos. They had been hailed as the Unbroken, a group of human prisoners deemed too valuable for immediate termination, too intriguing to simply discard. The Xylos, a species whose entire civilization was built on logic and efficiency, wanted to understand humanity's capacity for resistance. They wanted to break it, to dissect it, to find the flaw in the human spirit that allowed them to endure seemingly insurmountable odds. Their prison was a Xylos research facility, a fortress of cold, gleaming metal and unblinking surveillance. Each cell was a meticulously designed psychological cage, isolating its occupant while constantly monitoring their every breath, every tremor of despair. The Xylos, with their multiple, glowing green eyes and slender, almost ethereal forms, rarely spoke. They observed, they analyzed, and they implemented. Sarah's cellmate was Sergeant Jax, a grizzled veteran whose face looked like a roadmap of bad decisions and good fights. His humor, sharp and irreverent, had been a lifeline in the suffocating void of their capture. Another cellmate, though physically separated, was Dr. Eris Thorne, the brilliant xenolinguist who, ironically, was the first human to attempt communication with the Xylos. He now sat in a similar cell, his once energetic demeanor replaced by a quiet, contemplative air. The Xylos' methods were insidious. They didn't resort to crude physical torture. They isolated, they deprived, they manipulated. They would play recordings of human suffering, of Earth cities burning, of loved ones crying out in agony. They would project holographic images of humanity's impending doom, statistics of their dwindling forces, cold, hard facts designed to crush all hope. But humanity, as the Xylos were slowly and frustratingly discovering, was not entirely logical. Sarah remembered the first week. The Xylos had subjected them to a constant barrage of grim news. Earth had fallen. The Federation fleet was annihilated. Humanity was doomed. The despair had been a palpable thing, a suffocating blanket that threatened to extinguish every spark of life. It was Jax who broke the silence, not with a sob, but with a snort. "You know what this reminds me of?" he'd rasped, his voice hoarse from disuse. "That time Lieutenant Davies tried to cook a gourmet meal on a single-burner field stove. Ended up setting fire to his hair and blaming the rations." Sarah, despite the crushing weight of their situation, had let out a weak chuckle. Dr. Thorne, in his adjacent cell, had managed a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a tiny crack in the Xylos' perfectly constructed psychological wall, but it was a crack nonetheless. The Xylos observers, watching from behind their one-way mirrors, had registered the anomaly. Subject response, laughter. Data indicates no logical reason for this emotional output in current parameters. Their reports would be cold, clinical, and utterly baffled. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The Xylos escalated their tactics. They removed all entertainment, all stimulation. They imposed forced silence. But humans, as it turned out, were remarkably good at making their own noise. Jack started recounting his most embarrassing pre-war escapades. "There was this time on Rigel 6, he'd begin, his voice a low rumble, just loud enough to be picked up by the hidden mics but not so loud as to trigger the painful sonic dampeners the Xylos sometimes employed. Had a little too much of that Zygnian nectar. Woke up painted purple, spooning a startled Glimmerian ambassador, and convinced I could fly." Sarah would respond with tales of her own, stories of cadet training gone wrong, of awkward diplomatic dinners, of her irrational fear of spacefaring mollusks. Her voice, usually so crisp and authoritative, would soften, warmed by the memory, by the shared humanity of the moment. Dr. Thorne, initially more reserved, began to contribute. He'd share intricate, fantastical stories from ancient Earth mythology, weaving tales of gods and monsters, of heroes and villains, of epic journeys and impossible love. He'd narrate with an almost professorial flair, his words a vibrant splash of color in their gray prison. "Did you know," he'd whisper, "that on Earth, we once believed that a giant, invisible elephant held up the world?" Jax would snort, "Sounds about right for our luck." The Xylos analysts were in a quandary. Their data showed that these narrative exchanges were boosting the subject's morale. Their despair metrics were plummeting. Their hope index was inexplicably rising. It defied all logic. Why would stories of fictional beings, or embarrassing personal anecdotes, offer solace in the face of imminent galactic destruction? One cycle, the Xylos implemented what they termed Sensory Deprivation Protocol Gamma. All light was extinguished. All sound was muffled to an oppressive drone. They hoped the absolute void would finally break the human spirit. But humans had imaginations. In the pitch black, suffocating silence, their voices became even more vital. They began to describe imaginary feasts. "All right, Jax," Sarah would begin, "tonight, we're having a triple-layered chocolate cake, with raspberry filling and a fresh cream frosting. And it's enormous." Jax would add, "And next to that, a plate of sizzling, spicy Orion prime ribs, so tender the meat falls off the bone. And a mug of that potent Arcturian ale, thick and golden." Dr. Thorne, his voice a calm counterpoint, would describe the intricate flavors, the aroma, the very texture of the food. The subtle notes of starfruit in the ale, the way the spices on the ribs activate different taste receptors in sequence, creating a symphony of flavor. They didn't just describe food, they described entire imaginary worlds. They built cities in their minds, explored alien jungles, sailed across oceans of pure thought. They painted vibrant mental landscapes, sharing every detail, every color, every sound with each other, creating a shared reality far more vivid than the desolate one they physically inhabited. The Xylos' sensors registered only silence, broken occasionally by the low murmur of voices. But their biological scanners showed brain activity levels consistent with active engagement, enjoyment, and even creative output. It was an enigma. The subjects were happier in complete darkness. It made no sense. Sarah often thought about her family. Her younger brother, always joking, always finding the absurdity in every situation. Her mother, who could spin the most ordinary events into grand, dramatic tales. It was in their blood, this resilience, this defiant joy in the face of overwhelming despair. It wasn't something you learned, it was something you were. One Xylos observer, identified only as Unit 734, began to log a peculiar pattern. The human subjects, despite the overwhelming evidence of their species' defeat, exhibited an unusual phenomenon: irrational optimism. This optimism was not based on any logic. Sarah, Jax, and Dr. Thorne sat through it, their bodies outwardly still. But inwardly, they fought back. Jax started humming, off-key at first, then gaining confidence, a crude but defiant rendition of an old Terran folk song. Sarah joined in, her voice surprisingly clear, filling the cell with a melody the Xylos had tried to corrupt. Dr. Thorne, after a moment, added a layer of spoken word, reciting poetry he remembered from his youth, poems of beauty, of resilience, of love. Their voices blended, a defiant chorus against the distorted cacophony. They weren't just singing, they were reclaiming. They were asserting their right to joy, their right to memory, their right to beauty. They were recreating their culture, piece by piece, within the very walls of their prison. Unit 734 reported, subjects are actively reinterpreting negative stimuli as positive. Sonic patterns are being counteracted by self-generated auditory output. Visual stimuli, destruction of heritage, are being disregarded, with subjects focusing on internalized positive narratives. The Xylos High Command was baffled. Their entire strategy relied on the logical breakdown of the enemy. But humans weren't logical. They laughed when they should have cried. They sang when they should have despaired. They imagined feasts in starvation. It was maddening. Sarah herself felt a surge of triumph during these moments. It wasn't about escape, not anymore. It was about winning the internal war. It was about proving that some things simply couldn't be broken. One cycle, the Xylos tried a more direct approach. They brought in a single, unblinking Xylos interrogator into Sarah's cell. The creature's green eyes glowed with an unnerving intensity. Its voice, a series of clicks and hisses translated by a sterile wall-mounted device, was devoid of any emotion. Subject: Sarah. You continue to defy statistical probability. Your species is defeated. Your hope is illogical. Explain. Sarah looked at the Xylos. She could have given a lecture on human psychology, on the power of the imagination, on the concept of spirit. But she knew those words would be meaningless to a creature of pure logic. Instead, she simply smiled. It was a genuine smile, a warm, defiant curve of her lips that carried the weight of a million human experiences. You want to know why? She asked, her voice calm. Because you haven't seen the funniest prank Jax ever pulled on a disgruntled chef. Because you haven't heard Dr. Thorne's dramatic recitation of the Ballad of the Space Potato. Because you haven't tasted the imaginary Arcturian ale. The Xylos interrogator simply stared, its multifaceted eyes unblinking. These are illogical responses. They do not correlate with existing data regarding interrogation protocols. Sarah leaned forward, her smile widening. Exactly. That's the point. You see, Xylos, you're trying to break us by taking everything away. But you can't take away our ability to make something out of nothing. You can't take away our stories. You can't take away our jokes. You can't take away our laughter. She paused, then added, and honestly, you just don't get the punchline. The interrogator remained silent for a long moment, its alien mind struggling with the concept. It was trying to compute. Trying to find the logic in a punchline. The Xylos had no concept of humor that wasn't derived from a logical incongruity. The sheer, illogical joy of human laughter was an impenetrable wall. The report filed by Unit 734 after that interrogation was unprecedented. Subject: Sarah displayed a smile, an emotional output correlated with positive internal state. Subject used humor as a counterinterrogation tactic. Data indicates a fundamental disconnect in psychological warfare efficacy against human subjects. Recommend reevaluation of all protocols. The Xylos, for all their technological superiority, for all their logical precision, were losing the war against the human spirit. Their vast resources, their advanced psychological tools, were powerless against an enemy that simply refused to despair on schedule. Sarah, Jax, and Dr. Thorne didn't know what the future held. They didn't know if they would ever see Earth again, if humanity would truly survive. But as long as they had voices to tell stories, imaginations to conjure feasts, and hearts to find humor in the darkest of places, they knew they hadn't lost. One day, the cell doors remained open. Not just Sarah's, but Jax's and Dr. Thorne's as well. A Xylos emissary, its green eyes flickering with what almost seemed like confusion, stood in the corridor. Humans, the translator device clicked, its voice flat. Your species has proven unpredictable. Your resilience, despite overwhelming odds, has defied our logical models. Sarah, Jax, and Dr. Thorne exchanged a glance. There was no triumph in their eyes, only a quiet, resolute understanding. Your continued irrational optimism. The Xylos continued, the phrase sounding like an admission of defeat, has rendered our re-education and interrogation protocols inefficient. High Command has determined that further expenditure of resources is illogical. They were being released. Not because they had fought their way out, but because they had laughed their way out. They had confused their captors so thoroughly that the Xylos had simply given up. As they were escorted to a transport, heading towards a neutral zone, Sarah looked back at the cold, sterile facility. She thought of all the stories they had told, all the jokes they had shared, all the imaginary feasts they had savored. These weren't just coping mechanisms, they were weapons. Weapons of the human spirit, forged in despair, tempered by laughter, and ultimately, unconquerable. Jax nudged her, a familiar grin on his face. So, Captain, he began, his voice filled with newfound freedom. Heard a new one while you were dealing with the shiny ones. Why did the Xylos cross the galaxy? Sarah, a genuine, heartfelt laugh bubbling up from deep within her, shook her head. I'm sure it's illogical, Sergeant. Jax winked. To get to the punchline, Captain. To get to the punchline. And as their transport lifted off, leaving the Xylos facility behind, the sound of human laughter, illogical and beautiful, echoed across the void, a defiant declaration of humanity's enduring, unbreakable spirit. It was the sound of victory, not of battles won, but of spirits unbroken. It was the sound of hope, illogical and persistent, resounding across the vast, indifferent cosmos.